Hey everyone, Corey DeVos here, and thanks for joining us for yet another episode of The Ken Show. I'm joined as always by my very good friend and mentor, Ken Wilber. Ken, how you doing, man?
Good, Betty. Great to see you.
Good. Yeah, it's great to see you. Just before the show, we were talking about just how awesome last month's episode was, where we went through the major and minor scales of your integral politics model.
Right.
And man, I mean, we spent 3.5 hours unpacking that. And, I just find that I'm thinking about it every day. I'm still unpacking it throughout the month. And, I'm the type of person who consumes a lot of political news. And it is amazing how helpful that discussion was for me. There's so many things, so many sort of takeaways, I think that I and hopefully our viewers, had around that piece.
Right.
For one, I think it was such an incredible interpretive frame that really helps us make better sense of, where we're at today and where we've been and where we might actually be able to go from here, which is really cool.
Yeah.
It helps me see how these, sort of political and governmental dynamics are actually playing themselves out in real time. And I think more than anything, it's helped me sort of resist my own kind of slide into one kind of tribalism or another, just by, simply acknowledging that there really is no such thing as a monolithic left over there and a monolithic right over there. I mean, these are all, again, broad coalitions of different views and values that are all sort of vying for control of our major political parties. And I think that, the conversation that we had just really helps us expand our vocabulary a bit, see a few things that we weren't really able to notice before, and hopefully will help, these kinds of conversations actually, find just a little bit more traction in this world. And because it's, becoming increasingly clear to me, Ken, that this world really needs these conversations. So I was thinking today, yeah, we would basically pick up where we left off last month, continue the discussion. We did such a great job of sort of getting all the pieces on the chessboard. Now we get to actually move those pieces around and, have a little bit of fun together.
Right.
And before we, started with the big questions, I thought maybe we would spend a little time and actually talk about, what is sort of the current condition of the chessboard itself. So, I was thinking maybe we could do basically like a quick reality check. I just want to see if, you see what I see, because, what I see, Ken, is this really, really rapid emergence of what's basically an entire new set of life conditions, a new set of, global challenges and realities that have never existed before. And I think that these changing life conditions are what's really, demanding an integral response and integral solutions and new sort of integral strategies of self-organization. As we often say, actually anything less than integral at this point in the game is really just going to make things worse.
Yeah.
It's going to be partial solutions that create, an even bigger mess. And in terms of these life conditions, I see it just everywhere. I see it all around us. Really in all four quadrants. There's the ticking time bomb of climate change, and we've been getting a lot of really scary reports coming out in recent weeks, being like, guys, hey, you've got 10 years to figure this out, maybe, if we're lucky, to do, basically a moonshot type, set of solutions to help mitigate the damage that we're inflicting to our climate, and therefore to our, long-term sustainability on this planet. There's the prevalence of plutocracy and, this historically significant, historically huge wealth inequality that we're struggling with right now. We've got, things that we've discussed in previous episodes. We've got the rise of social media and the polarization and the balkanization of culture that's come out of that. We've got this sort of systemic regression towards things like nationalism and populism that we're seeing all throughout the West. We're seeing this epistemic collapse of the post-truth world, the violent inflammation of all first tier stages, which is itself a result of, kind of a total breakdown of the developmental conveyor belt, which is, resulting in even larger, wider, deeper gaps and divisions between all of us. And when I sort of list it all out like that, it sounds, it sounds really daunting and even a little bit depressing. And, I think it is daunting and it is depressing. But at the same time, it's, we've been talking about this years, and in so many ways, this is all kind of arriving right on schedule, right? And, I think more importantly, what it means is that, I think the stage is actually being set for integral ideas and integral solutions to begin actually finding, again, some real traction in the world in a way that we've never really, been able to see in the past. Yeah, I think human beings, we've proven to ourselves time and time again just how terrible we are at seeing the problem and coming up with a proactive set of solutions to, to try to mitigate the problem. We're really bad at that. But what we're good at, what we're really, really good at is adapting. Whenever our realities and our life conditions just change from underneath our feet, we adapt. And we find these new patterns of self-organization that are more efficient, more sustainable, just better in most ways than what we had before. But it's like you need the challenge in order to for that to really begin to emerge and hit sort of the tipping point that we really want to see these things eventually hit.
And keep in mind that it's sort of one of the standard things to do when we worry about what's happening tomorrow is we focus on all of these negative things, and you can really pile them up. Mm-hmm. And integral, in a sense, gives you a large number of tools to find even more things going wrong. More dimensions that people don't take into account, and you go, oh, well, you think that's bad, look at this thing. So that can start to become pretty overwhelming when you do that. But you and I have also talked about the fact that there's a type of revolution occurring in all four quadrants. And although you can never tell which way innovations go, the assumption is at least some of them are headed in very, very positive ways. And so if we look in the upper right quadrant, just the work that's been done on genomics, for example, I mean, we are very close to wipe out genetic illnesses entirely. There's already a renegade Chinese scientist that's used CRISPR, the gene editing technology, to actually change a human zygote, put it in a human being who's going to have that child and start reproducing that edited gene. The entire world is alarmed by that, but that's the direction that we're going. And that could have enormous positive consequences. One of the things that it's very likely going to do is increase average lifespan well into the hundreds. One of the things that I've always said is, well, if that actually happens, first of all, I figure out how to pay for it. But second of all, what would people actually end up doing? I mean, even if you, retired at 80, what would you do for the next 80 years? I mean, you've only lived half your life. And sort of one of the utopian ideas about that is, well, one of the few areas that people could explore that they hadn't explored before was their own interior developmental awakening and states of enlightenment, metamorphosis, satori, moksha, etc. And so people would actually have the time, and they might not be bored senseless for other stuff they can do. So they are pursuing that. If we look at what's happening with robotics, if we look at what's happening with artificial intelligence itself, we're almost certainly headed quickly towards augmented humans.
Hmm.
And that's going to change things profoundly. And one of the things it's going to depend upon whether this change is positive and in a positive feedback loop, or whether it gets in a really negative feedback loop and drives us right into the ground. But part of the idea is going to be, okay, we have this augmented reality and we can plug directly into the entire internet, the entire cloud, and have all of that information available to us in our own awareness anytime we want it. So the question at that point really does become, okay, what values do society set on those types of information? And that's one of the things that an integral approach can help with doing, because it acknowledges pretty much all values, but it also sets them in a framework where they're oriented to each other, and you can actually see certain priorities. And priorities with, like, say, developmental stages, it's always in one direction. It's towards more inclusion, more diversity, more perspectives. It's never the other way. The higher you go in a growth hierarchy, it's not the more people you oppress, it's the people you include. And each higher stage on a growth hierarchy includes more perspectives and more people. Whereas on dominator hierarchies, each higher stage you go, the more people you can oppress and dominate and all that. And unfortunately, most postmodernists have confused those two and thrown them both out. And so that's a disaster. But these types of profound changes in augmented humanity are coming. They're coming in the upper right quadrant. It's going to be a profound sort of type of revolution. Again, not to mention just the actual physiology of continuing cell growth, so that a lifespan really does start to get to be 100, 200, 300 years. And we have no idea what to do with that. In the lower right quadrant, Kurzweil's overall singularity. I mean, that's coming this way, whether you agree with exactly Kurzweil's version of it or not. Technological innovation does continue to proceed at an exponential rate. So it's only a matter of time before absolutely off the wall, outrageous types of learning machines start to come into being. And again, the best thing we can do with that is use it to augment humanity and not simply start supplanting or even replacing humanity, which are, as you know, a fair number of technologists think will happen. As one put it, the first time that we create a super intelligent machine, that will be the last thing that we create. But given the sort of positiveness of what can happen in the lower right quadrant in terms of what a truly enhanced artificial intelligence could bring, we're also in an unfortunate transition where, for a very large percentage of people, particularly in the lower middle class to middle class, technology has displaced an enormous number of jobs right now. We expect at some point it will start creating new types of jobs, but we're between those two worlds right now. And one study even showed that over the last 20 years or so, about 80% of jobs that were lost due to automation. So this is hurting. But it's still, on balance, has to be counted as at least having some sort of potential positive contributions that we're not really quite sure of right now. In the lower left, the idea is that we are slowly moving towards, certainly in the developed countries, stages of cultural development that are starting to push into integral second tier. And that's going to be a cultural singularity. That's going to be a cultural transformation, the likes of which we've never seen, ever. And so that's the way. Latest estimates put it that it could happen roughly as soon, that is to say that getting a 10% tipping point at second tier can happen roughly about the same time that the technological singularity is supposed to occur. So somewhere around 2040, 2050, we could see both of these things happening. And that would be a change in the cultural lower left meaning systems and a change in the techno-economic infrastructure occurring at the same time, along with the continuing gains in the upper right. So this could start to be really stunning. And in the upper left, we have this increasing understanding and desire also of types of awareness that move into both second tier in growing up, and an increasing awareness at some degree of the fact that we also have things like waking up, and those are very important. So all of these factors are on the table with all of these negative factors.
Yep.
And part of the difficulty, I mean, as you point out, humans don't have a very good history of seeing a problem coming and then addressing it so that they ward off the problem. Almost always they see the problem coming, they wait, the problem hits and devastates them, and then they build their way out of the mess. I used to joke and say the only guy in history who actually fixed the problem before it was Noah. He actually saw the thing coming, actually built the solution and survived. The only time I've ever heard humanity doing that. So we're not good at that. It does suggest that we, of all these positives and then negatives, that it most likely, not necessarily, but most likely might be something bad happening on the negative side of the street that forces some sort of organization of what we're doing. And all of this is indeed in the backdrop of a civilization that, however we define it, is in some ways becoming more and more global.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't really that long ago before we even started talking about something like the global village. It was like, wow, that was really happening. And that was news to a lot of people. It really been 30 or 40 years when we started to actually think in those kinds of terms. But happening is that, as we pointed out last time, we do have this economic system that, as it increasingly becomes transnational, deals across borders, starts to take on seriously global dimensions. Whereas virtually all of the regulators that we have are at level of nation state or even earlier. And so we're having a really difficult time coming up with ways that any form of government can regulate what's going on globally. So we have things like the United Nations and so on, and they attempt to try, but everybody realizes that's a pretty really hobbled system. It runs into the standard problem that you get when you look at today's thought leaders or the essential sort of cultural leaders. An enormous number of them are at green. And again, it's a broken green.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, even that language has been adopted by the terrorists. I mean, terrorists talk boomeritis. It's like, oh, we're doing this for our freedom. We're doing this for our self-expression. We're doing this because we're being true to ourselves. And that they'll have a better chance in the press doing talking something like that. And so it worked. I mean, the press still has, if you say anything bad about an Islamic terrorist, anything, then you have Islamophobia and you're a racist. So it's bizarre in terms of how that's turning out.
And, you know, Ken, I think it's interesting because, you know, it's not like, how do I want to say this? These developmental stages, they often come before the world really needs them, right? I mean, we've had integral thinkers like yourself for the last 40 years, you know, doing your work. And, you know, in a lot of ways, you've been a pioneer and you've been sort of laying down this groundwork before these life conditions, I think, really started manifesting in as powerful of a way as they are today. So in a lot of ways, you know, you're ahead of your time, and in certain ways, you're, again, sort of right on schedule. But this has been true, you know, all throughout. It's, you know, the first postmodern thinkers didn't emerge, you know, in the 1960s. They emerged in the early 20th century and, you know, enjoyed a status that Roger Walsh called a cognitive minority. In a lot of ways, I think that's the same status that, you know, us integralists have you know, been enjoying for the last couple of decades. We've been a cognitive minority, but I kind of get the sense that things could change, you know, pretty quickly and pretty radically in sort of the decades to come. And another really interesting thing about these life conditions as they're presenting themselves today is I think there's something going on here that's a little bit unprecedented historically. And that is, you know, all the previous stages as they emerged, they were largely emerging in reaction to the disasters of the previous stage. So, you know, green emerged in response to, you know, the disasters of orange, and orange emerged in response to the disasters of amber, and sort of, you know, on it goes. I think that with integral, it's actually taking shape a little bit differently. You know, it seems to me anyway, I'm curious to know what you think about this, but it seems to me that, you know, it's because it's the first stage that actually acknowledges and wants to include all of these previous stages. The integral stage itself is emerging out of sort of the entire spiral, or rather, you know, out of the collapse of the entire spiral. So it's a little bit, integral is not pushing against green, it's pushing against sort of these massive gaps that are opening up between all of these developmental levels. That's where sort of the integral roots, I think, can be found. And it's those roots that, when this actually does come into its fullest expression, I think it's these roots that exist in these gaps between us that's actually going to start weaving things back together, allowing us to weave the world back together in a certain kind of sense. So it seems to me that, you know, all across the spiral and all four quadrants, we've got these accelerating life conditions. And I think that these life conditions really form sort of the overall context for today's call, as well as all of the conversations that we've been having. It's why you and I have been doing this. It's why we do the work that we do to bring integral into the world. And I think it's, you know, it's why it's not only such a scary time to be alive right now, but also a really, really exciting time. And so I'm wondering, Ken, you know, basically, do you see what I see? Are these, do you agree with sort of my assessment of how integral is really emerging out of not just, you know, this sort of layer of pathologies that we're seeing developmentally, but out of this entire, you know, kind of breakdown of the spiral itself?
You raised this whole issue about couldn't integral be responding to the whole spiral in terms of deficits along the whole thing. And that's certainly the case. And at the same time, one of the problems is that whatever the acknowledged leading edge is supposed to be, then it should be operating to mitigate some of those problems. And for any number of complex reasons, and not just Green's, but with Green being at the leading edge of cultural evolution for about 5 decades now, they have to assume, you have to take a special look at that, you have to assume a special responsibility for that. Just as at the previous stage when Orange was the leading edge, it had to assume a type of responsibility for some of the nasty things occurred there.
Right.
Everything from seriously increasing industrial pollution, even missile crisis. I mean, those were all, to some degree, to kind of the whole developmental sequence falling apart, but it was due especially to the way that the leading edge itself handled it. That's what leading edges are supposed to do.
Right.
In any evolutionary system, I mean, you see a little plant being born, and there's always a growing tip. And that growing tip is always trying to find ways, if it's like a seed that's planted under a pavement, everybody's seen, seedlings pushing up through pavements. But that's what growing tips do. And that's why Maslow referred to self-actualizing people as the growing tip of humanity, that they were pushing forward into ways that have more freedom, more liberty, more fullness, more potentials, more capacities. And that just is kind of an endless unfolding. Nobody's saying, oh, well, whatever stage we're at, the highest stage there is. No, that's not it at all. But there is this increasing inclusiveness, increasing diversity in the true sense of the word. And that's what each of the leading edges are supposed to do. And then when we get up to the leading edge of Green, one of the main problems that Green itself has is it's sometimes referred to as a pluralistic stage. Claire Graves, of course, called it a relativistic stage. And relativism is a nightmare for a leading edge, because it really can't make that it can commit to. And so nothing but a series of really bad performative self-predictions result from something like that. And so we really have been kind of set loose in a worldwide cultural atmosphere that doesn't have an assurance about certain very central values that it should be following. And so it proclaims all of them equal or egalitarian, and therefore all cultures are equal or multicultural. And there are no values in general that are better than any other values. And that's how they get by default at egalitarianism. The problem with that is that Green stage itself, when it says that all values need to be treated the same, itself means that that's the one correct way to look at things.
Right.
And so it has the one correct value when it says that all other values are equal, but it's really saying this value is superior in a world where nothing is supposed to be superior. So that leaves it wide open to just an enormous number of contradictory, conflict-ridden, and in particular, confusing signals on how to go forward. And I'll come back to that, but in terms of what that does as a leading edge, is it leaves essentially all of the earlier stages without a real coherent growing tip. They don't have any really morphogenetic field coming down from on top and just nudging them in the essentially correct direction. And so what you get is runaway amber ethnocentric. What you get is runaway amber well, let me preface it by saying, because you're talking about the problems with the market system worldwide and the difficulties that it creates. One of the major ways that green, that orange actually divides the world up. Amber divides the world into saints and sinners. Orange divides the world into winners and losers. And then green divides the world into sensitive and insensitive. And the problem with orange, because the market system worldwide is essentially an orange-driven value structure. And the main value that it has embedded in it is winner versus loser. And so that's one of the, if you look at any of the sort of major criticisms about capitalism or something like that, is that it inculcates that type of intensely competitive winner versus loser mentality. And the problem then becomes that because that market system is global, again, we don't have any regulatory capacities that can actually get in there and help smooth things out. And so one of the problems is that if any country wants to introduce something, let's just about global warming, if one particular country wants to introduce real significant changes in its carbon footprint so that it either massively taxes it or other sort of punitive actions on that, including business, then what happens is that that country, although it can be considered noble, it immediately becomes less effective in the world marketplace. And a year or two later, it's going to be dead, basically, through no fault of its own. It's trying to do something noble. And so we don't have a system set up well that when one nation state does something that is good for the commons, but will hurt it economically, it's discouraged from even doing that. And in many cases won't. So even with the Paris Accords, where everybody, you know, all the countries in the world except 2 signed up for that. And now the vast majority of them aren't anywhere near the goals that they promised. And look at Paris and Macron's increasing the gas tax to help drive non-fossil fuel types of energy and to help pay for the creation of green energy. And they have the worst riots of anybody since probably 1968. I mean, it's really getting kind of crazy. So part of the difficulty is we have this global market driven by winning versus losing mentalities. And the problem is, and we'll talk a little bit about this more later in terms of what we can actually do, but the problem is how can you tend to limit that without completely crushing the dynamism that does have some secondary positive benefits, as we talked about in really just the last couple decades. Overall percentage of poverty on planet Earth, which in 1895 was about 95% of the population, and in 2015 it's officially less than 10%.
Wow.
That is the most stunningly positive thing
Yep.
that happened to humanity in its history.
Yep.
It's unheard of what happened, and how that went down in the last 2 decades. So we do have all of these positive factors going on, and then we have all of these negative factors. And the point in any event is that none of those can be as understood as they can be if you use an integral framework. And we're talking about politics. Well, if you actually look at what's going on in politics, then it can become very enlightening and very useful, and really sort of spur ideas about how to take that forward. So we're going to have to see, and some of the changes that we can talk about certainly include technological changes. And we talked about augmented human beings. That or even keep talking about eventually coming upon a way that the human brain could just directly communicate with computer systems. And when that happens, that could dramatically change everything. But again, the question is, what type of value system are we going to hold that information in? And one of the main value systems that we have is the one provided by evolution. And that shows up in human beings as development. And the thing about development is, just as evolution itself went from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms, just kept getting more and more unified, more and more whole, more and more inclusive. That's what stages of human development do. And that simply becomes increasingly one of the most central and important issues that human beings have to take into account when they select a set of values that they want to carry forward. Because that is a choice. We're doing that. We've made choices based on the full AQUIL framework. We've certainly made choices based on which basic level of development are we coming from. Each of those has very different value systems. But we want to be able to take those into account. And particularly where we see, for example, that each higher stage adds a perspective that a human being can take. So they really do go from very egocentric or me-oriented to more ethnocentric or us-oriented, but it's still just my group versus all those other groups, until you get up to world-centric, and then it's a care and concern for all people, for all groups, for all tribes. It's a very simple but a absolutely central notion. Because again, let's say if you're having a world federation and there is some sort of titular head or president or CEO of it, however that might be selected, would you want that person to have a 3rd grade education or a 12th grade education? but probably at least 12th grade, over a little bit higher.
Yeah.
We don't get up asking as a questions. They make perfect sense to us. But again, strangely, somehow, in most developed countries, by the time you get to 18 and you've gone through 12 stages of increasing understanding and growth and development, and then all of a sudden you hit 12th grade, somewhere around age 17 or 18, and then absolutely everybody from that period on up is the same. No differences, nobody keeps growing, nobody keeps becoming more expansive and more inclusive and capable of embracing more diversity. We just stop. And then everybody is simply assumed to be exactly the same stage of inclusiveness or diversity, and they're not. And the problem with things like social justice warriors is that they understand the importance of these values like diversity and inclusion, but they don't see and they deny the stages of development that got their values in the first place.
That's right.
And so they're not helping, and they've actually hurt because they've denied all hierarchies entirely. And they don't see that growth hierarchies actually drive towards more diversity and more inclusivity. And dominator hierarchies do the opposite. Those are bad. But the only people that use dominator hierarchies are people at low stages of growth hierarchies. And people at high stages of growth hierarchies, they all condemn dominator hierarchies. So by tossing both of these out, you've tossed out the solution to dominator hierarchies. You simply have no way to get rid of them.
Right.
No understanding of the stages that lead to these things. So that is where even the entire spiral that's inflamed, and particularly you have things like sort of kind of leaving out the whole Midwest population of this country, as the elites on the coast sort of made the choices, and then this whole massive rebellion jumped up and voted in Trump because they were just completely being overlooked in terms of what these higher values are doing. And nobody was addressing that issue. And frankly, we've done that so poor. I think we're lucky that we didn't get somebody much worse than Trump.
Who would that be?
We were really asking for it.